Before the 20th Amendment was ratified, which set January 20th as the day for presidential inaugurations fell on March 4th. So why was George Washington's first inauguration delayed by almost 2 months? I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. On September 17, 1788, the Congress of the Confederation officially adopted the new Constitution as the law of the land, superseding the Articles of Confederation. They then passed resolutions setting several important milestones. The first Wednesday in January 1789, January 7th, was set for choosing the first senators and representatives, plus the presidential electors. The first president would be selected by the Electoral College on the first Wednesday in February, February 4th. And the first Wednesday in March, March 4th, would be the beginning of the new government, when the new Congress would meet for the first time. The presidential election of 1789 was very different from elections of today. There were no nominating conventions or even political parties. George Washington did not even campaign. Voter turnout was in the low single digits of the adult population. Only 6 states allowed any form of popular vote, and even then, it was for only white men who owned property. There were exceptions. Free black men could vote in 4 northern states. Women could vote in New Jersey until 1804. In some states, there was a nominal religious test for voting, such as belonging to a church, as long as it was the right church, depending on where one lived. The first state election was held on December 15, 1788, with others following over the next 3 weeks. Other states elected their presidential electors in the state legislatures, or used a combination of the legislatures and a popular vote. For 10 of the original 13 colonies, these electors were selected by the January 7th deadline. Rhode Island and North Carolina had not yet ratified the new Constitution, so were ineligible to participate in the election. New York was unable to agree on how they would select their electors by the January 7th deadline, so they did not participate. On February 4th, 1789, electors convened in each of the 10 states and cast their votes for president. Washington was named on all 69 ballots cast, making him the only president unanimously elected, a feat he duplicated 4 years later. With a president selected, the new federal government and Washington's presidential term were slated to start 4 weeks later, on March 4th, but there were logistical delays. On March 4th, the Senate and House of Representatives met for the first time in the new nation's capital, New York City. But both immediately adjourned because they lacked a quorum. Bad weather, travel problems, and even some hesitation prevented some representatives and senators from arriving in New York in time. As a result, the votes of the Electoral College for president could not be counted or certified. Finally, on April 1st, the House convened with a quorum for the first time and elected Frederick Muhlenberg as its first speaker. The Senate first reached quorum on April 6th and elected John Langdon as its first president pro tempore. That same day, Senator Langdon presided over a joint session of Congress to count the Electoral College votes and certify the results. Washington was officially elected the president, and John Adams his vice president. Now, someone better tell Washington. Secretary of the Continental Congress, Charles Thomson was appointed by the Senate to deliver a letter to Washington containing the news of his election. Thomson arrived at Mount Vernon on April 14th to deliver the official notification to Washington. Washington replied with his acceptance immediately. 2 days later, Washington, along with Thomson and Washington's aide, Colonel David Humphreys, made their way to New York City with what Washington hoped would be great haste. Washington was the biggest celebrity of the day, so when news of his election was announced, he was celebrated in almost every town he passed through. Alexandria, Virginia, Georgetown, Maryland, now part of Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Trenton, New Jersey. For example, in Philadelphia, a child placed a laurel crown on his head, after which he led a parade atop a white horse. In other towns, he received a floral arch. Flower girls tossed petals at his feet, and a chorus of women in white singing a welcoming ode. Washington did not make great haste. On April 21st, while Washington was traveling to New York, John Adams was officially sworn in as the vice president in the new Senate chamber. On April 23rd, Washington left Elizabethtown, New Jersey, aboard a magnificent barge made especially for the occasion. His symbolic 13 oarsmen navigated through the Kill-Van-Cole tidal strait into the upper New York Bay and on to the city. Surrounded by a large number of additional boats and to the sounds of celebratory cannon fire, Washington landed at Murray's Wharf at the foot of Wall Street. He was greeted with affection and honor by New York Governor George Clinton, as well as congressmen and citizens. A plaque now marks the landing spot. From there they proceeded through the streets of New York to Washington's new official residence and the public offices of the executive branch, like today's West Wing, the Franklin House, at 3 Cherry Street. So, how does one swear in a president? Lacking precedents to guide them in their preparations for the first presidential inauguration, Congress appointed a joint committee to consider the time, place, and manner in which to administer to Washington the presidential oath of office as required by the Constitution. Certain difficulties in planning and arrangements arose from the fact that Congress was meeting in New York's former City Hall, rechristened Federal Hall, which was in the middle of a renovation under the direction of Pierre L'Enfant, who would later design the plans for Washington, D.C. On April 25th, Congress adopted the Joint Committee's recommendation that the inaugural ceremonies take place the following Thursday, April 30th. Congress did make one change to the committee's recommendation. Instead of holding the ceremony in the Representatives' Chamber in Federal Hall, the oath would be administered on the second-floor balcony adjoining the Senate chamber. In their words, "To the end that the oath of office may be administered to the President in the most public manner, and that the greatest number of people of the United States, and without distinction, may witness the solemnity." Finally, Inauguration Day arrived. As the sun rose on April 30th, 1789, a crowd of people had already begun to gather around Washington's new residence. By noon, the crowd started to make their way to Federal Hall. At noon, Washington, dressed in an American-made dark brown suit trimmed with eagle buttons, white silk stockings, silver shoe buckles, a steel-hilted sword, and a dark red overcoat, rode alone in the state coach from Franklin House to Federal Hall. Troops of the city, members of Congress appointed to escort the president, and heads of executive departments of the government under the Confederation preceded the president's coach, while to the rear followed ministers of foreign countries and local citizenry. When Washington arrived at Federal Hall, he was formally introduced to the House and Senate. Then Vice President Adams announced it was time for the inauguration. Washington walked out to the second-floor balcony in view of throngs of admirers who had gathered in the streets below. Chancellor of New York, Robert Livingston, who had served on the Committee of Five which had drafted the Declaration of Independence, administered the presidential oath of office since there was no Chief Justice of the Supreme Court yet. Washington placed his hand on a Bible from St. John's Lodge No. 1, which had been hastily opened to Genesis, chapters 49 and 50. He then repeated the presidential oath as written in the new Constitution. According to legend, Washington then softly added, "So help me God," at the end. However, many scholars now question if he indeed said that. Washington then kissed the Bible. Chancellor Livingston turned to the assembled crowd and shouted, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States." The crowd cheered. Bells throughout the city rang. There was a 13-gun salute. Cannons on land and on the ships in the harbor fired, all in honor of the new president. Although not required by the Constitution, Washington retired from the balcony to the Senate chamber to deliver his 1,431-word-long inaugural address. 3 days before the inauguration, Congress passed this resolution. Resolved, that the oath shall have been administered to the President, he, attended by the Vice President and the members of the Senate and House of Representatives, shall proceed to St. Paul's Chapel to hear divine service to be performed by the chaplain of Congress already appointed. So, Washington and all walked the third of a mile to St. Paul's Chapel for the brief service. Afterwards, Washington was escorted back to Franklin House in his carriage where he dined alone. At the time, there were no inaugural balls, but there were still some more festivities in store. After the sun went down and the stars came out, Washington was driven to Chancellor Livingston's house at the lower part of Broadway. From the windows of the Chancellor's house, Washington watched what many called the finest fireworks display the country had ever seen. By now it was 10 o'clock, and Washington was tired. He made his way back to Franklin House by carriage, or at least he tried. The streets were still crowded with revelers, and Washington's carriage did not make it very far. Washington and his party were forced to abandon the carriage and walk home. And thus ended April 30th, 1789, and the only scheduled presidential inauguration to take place in a month other than January or March. Thanks for watching.